The clinking of ice against crystal stopped my breath. My brother, Tristan, stood by the grand fireplace like a peacock mid-display, his tailored suit jacket straining across his inflated chest. We were at the Vance family's annual holiday dinner, surrounded by 50 carefully curated guests who were all watching him. He raised his hand with theatrical slowness, and the room obliged him by falling silent. His eyes scanned the gathered crowd. The society pages people, the country club set, the ones who still believed their money insulated them from consequence. Then his gaze found me. Willow Vance, 28 years old. The quiet sister, the one people forgot about 3 seconds after introductions. I sat at the periphery of the table in my modest gray dress, the same one I'd owned for 3 years, watching the candlelight flicker across crystal and silver. He didn't smile at me. He smirked. That particular expression had been perfecting its cruelty since we were children, a twist of the mouth that conveyed absolute certainty in his superiority and absolute contempt for my existence. Now, he announced, his voice honeyed with malice, a moment of triumph for our family. We've finally managed to sell Willow's sad little shack on the beach. That pathetic, crumbling eyesore has been such a drag on our reputation. It's someone else's problem now. The funds are safely secured, where Willow can't accidentally squander them on her little hobbies. He laughed, rough, cruel, assured of his audience. Serafina, his wife of 6 years, leaned in close enough that her voice would carry. She was never going to make anything of it, darling. It was truly a favor to the family. A mercy, really. She smiled at me with the precision of a surgeon wielding a scalpel. You do understand, don't you, Willow? We were helping. The room erupted in performative, sympathetic chuckles. The kind of laughter that means we all agree you're insignificant. My hand flattened against the cool linen tablecloth. The room seemed to tilt slightly, as if the entire house had shifted on its foundation. The blood drained from my face so completely that I felt the cold settle in my fingertips. They had sold it. The Dunes cottage. My mother's cottage. The place that held every happy memory I possessed, every moment of genuine love, every whisper of belonging. They had sold it without my signature, without my consent, without any legal right whatsoever. What had just happened to me? I pressed my palm harder against the linen, feeling the threads compress beneath my skin. The physical sensation grounded me just enough to keep breathing. Around me, the dinner party continued its ritual dance, conversations resuming, wine glasses refilling, the evening rolling forward as if my world hadn't just fractured into before and after. But I was still there, still present, still breathing. Tristan caught my eye one more time across the room, and I saw it then, the certainty in his face that I was broken, finished, that this was the final, definitive move in a game he'd been winning my entire life. He had no idea what he'd just started. That night, I drove to the Dunes cottage in the dark. The coastal highway unfurled before me, moonlight painting the water in shades of silver and deep blue. My hands gripped the steering wheel with a steadiness that belied the hurricane moving through my chest. The rational part of my mind kept attempting to catalog what I knew. Tristan was executor of Dad's estate. Mom had specifically deeded the cottage to me before she passed. But Tristan had used his executor position to stall the transfer for years, claiming I was too fragile to handle the responsibilities of property ownership. He wielded that excuse like a weapon, firing it at me in family meetings, in lawyers' offices, in moments of spectacular public humiliation. You're not stable enough, Willow. You don't understand financial management, Willow. We're protecting you, Willow. I had believed him. That was the shameful part. I had internalized every insult, every diminishment, every careful suggestion that I was somehow broken and needed supervision. And while I was drowning in that manufactured inadequacy, He was planning how to use his executor authority to commit fraud on a scale that would have impressed a career criminal. The cottage appeared through the darkness. A small, four-room house perched on the edge of the water, its white walls silvered by moonlight. The porch railing I'd painted 3 years ago was weathered now, the blue fading back to gray. The garden my mother had loved had gone to seed, wild and unkempt. There were lights on inside. The new owners, probably the ones Tristan had already sold to without mentioning any of this to me. I didn't go inside. I couldn't face the sight of their belongings in my mother's rooms. I just stood on the sand, breathing in the salt air, and let myself feel the loss. The cottage looked smaller than I remembered. The waves were pulling away from the shoreline, leaving smooth, wet sand in their wake. The tide was going out, carrying pieces of my childhood with it. I stood there for a long time, maybe an hour, maybe longer, long enough for the cold to seep into my bones, long enough for something inside me to shift, not break, but reorganize, like a fault line, suddenly finding new pressure points. When I finally drove away, I didn't go home. Instead, I drove inland, away from the coast, toward a building that Tristan didn't know existed. A discreet, low-key office structure I rented under a numbered corporation, far away from the social circles where he mattered. The building was mostly empty at night, just security and a few dedicated workaholics. I used my key card to enter through the underground garage, took the private elevator to the 32nd floor, and walked into my real office. The walls were lined with screens. The desk held 3 monitors and a phone system that cost more than most people's cars. Maps of coastal property holdings covered one entire wall, color-coded by ownership, by corporate affiliation, by utility value. This was where I lived, in the spaces between companies, in the layered architecture of corporate ownership that I'd spent 6 years meticulously constructing. I picked up the phone and called my lawyer. Elias Thorne answered on the second ring. He never slept. I'd never quite determined if this was a professional choice or a personal one, but it made him infinitely useful. Elias, I said, my voice steady. Tristan sold the Dunes cottage today, publicly, at a family dinner. He used his executor authority and committed title fraud against the actual deed holder. He's closing the sale within the week. I could hear him sit up straighter, his legal mind already racing. Willow, we can file an injunction immediately. Halt the sale. This is textbook fraud. No, I cut him off. My voice was calm, but it had the weight of absolute certainty behind it. Let him close the deal. Let him think he won. If we stop it now, it becomes a family squabble, a he-said-she-said property dispute. But if he completes the illegal transfer of title, if he actually hands over the deed, he has no legal right to distribute. That's a criminal offense. Wire fraud, document forgery, real charges. The buyers will lose their money, Elias said carefully. The buyers made a choice. I replied. Tristan made his. I need you to find them. Get me names, finances, everything. We need to know who's about to become collateral damage in this family war. There was a pause. Elias was one of the few people in my life who understood what I actually was beneath the quiet exterior. He didn't approve of everything, but he was loyal in the way that truly brilliant people are, loyal to capability, to precision, to the architecture of a well-constructed plan. What are you going to do? He asked. What he should have been afraid I'd do all along, I said. Then I hung up and waited for dawn. The buyers' names were Edward and Patricia Whitlock, retired, Midwestern, thrilled to be moving to the beach for their golden years. Elias sent me their file at 6 a.m., a dossier of financial records, family photos, their entire beautiful, vulnerable life laid out in documents. They had sold a home they'd owned for 32 years. They had their life savings invested in the Dunes cottage. They had already retired early, already told their grandchildren they'd be spending summers at the beach. Guilt was a knot in my chest, but I pushed past it. This wasn't my consequence to bear. Tristan had created this situation. Tristan had decided that my inheritance, my mother's gift, my only sanctuary, was worth stealing for his own financial desperation. The Whitlocks would become collateral damage, yes, but only because of Tristan's greed, not because of my decisions. I had to believe that. I had to believe in the justice of what was coming. I called Elias back at 7 a.m. I need you to do 3 things simultaneously. First, authenticate my mother's original deed, the one I've had in the private lawyer's vault for 7 years. Get it filed with the county immediately, establishing my clear, legal ownership predating any other claims. Second, research the infrastructure easement clause in the Azure Shores Resort's corporate mandates. Third, pull together every piece of documentation on Seaview Property Group and its sublease agreements. That's a lot of moving pieces. Elias said, "What's the endgame here?" "Complete systemic destruction," I answered. But first, we let him finish hanging himself. The day the Whitlocks came for their final walkthrough, Serafina called me at 10 a.m. "Oh, Willow, darling." Her voice dripped with artificial sympathy, the kind she'd perfected over years of charity galas and country club politics. "You must be absolutely heartbroken. But, the little shack really had to go. Such a burden. Listen, sweetheart, the new owners are coming for a final inspection this afternoon. Could you please run over and clean up all your little things? Your boxes of notes and dust and whatever. Make it presentable for the poor Whitlocks. They're such sweet people." She was asking me to clean up the crime scene, to erase the evidence of my life so that her theft would look cleaner. I made my voice small, defeated. Everything she wanted to believe about me. "Of course, Serafina. I'll go right now." The performance was essential. I drove to the Dunes cottage with my heart beating in a steady, controlled rhythm. I spent the day gathering evidence, not cleaning. I filled a small box with tangible pieces of my mother. Her favorite seashell, worn smooth by decades of tide and time. A copy of her poetry book, pages marked with her handwriting. The tiny silver key she'd given me on my 16th birthday, the one I'd never understood the purpose of until I was old enough to realize it opened a safety deposit box that contained the authenticated deed and financial documents she'd set aside for my future. Then I took out the specialized tablet, the one connected directly to Vance Consolidated Holdings' private surveying network, and performed the task I'd been planning for months. I stood in the center of the cottage's living room and mapped the exact coordinates of the 4 corners of the foundation. This was the trap I'd set carefully, deliberately, years before Tristan even knew he was walking toward it. The foundation was 1.5 meters into the federally mandated coastal setback line, a violation that had existed for decades, but one that had been recently flagged by a new coastal auditor, an auditor I'd quietly retained through a shell corporation 2 years prior. The Azure Shores Resort covenants explicitly prohibited this type of foundation placement. It was written into every property agreement, every deed restriction, every corporate mandate that governed the resort's development. In other words, the cottage that my mother had owned and that I had inherited was technically in violation of the resort's infrastructure covenants. And the resort had specific legally enforceable options for addressing such violations. I texted Elias the coordinates, lock and load. Coastal setback violation confirmed. Proceed with infrastructure easement filing. Then I stood on the small, weathered deck and looked out at the ocean one last time. The wood was cool beneath my bare feet. The light was beginning to shift toward evening, painting everything in shades of gold and amber. My mother had taught me many things in the time we had together, but the most important was this. Strength isn't about shouting. It's about knowing your moment. It's about understanding the architecture of power and building your own version of it from the inside out. I didn't cry. I watched the ocean and allowed the grief to transform into something harder, colder, more useful, a polished stone of certainty in my chest. Before I left, I deliberately left a few items behind. A dusty easel that had belonged to my mother, some old gardening gloves, a stack of her journals. Exactly the things that Tristan would assume I valued enough to want back. It was one final lie to believe, the lie that I had accepted his pathetic finder's fee and his condescending charity in exchange for my silence. He would need that lie. It would comfort him, right up until the moment everything collapsed. The closing was held in a sterile office tower downtown, the kind of place designed specifically to eliminate any sense of place or permanence. Tristan and Serafina arrived wearing expressions of theatrical triumph, treating the Whitlocks like dear friends they were welcoming into an exclusive club. I sat silently in a corner, wearing the same gray dress I'd worn to the holiday dinner. Appropriate, modest, defeated, invisible. Tristan kept his arm around Serafina, dropping names of prestigious firms he'd supposedly landed as clients, expanding his consulting business empire. He was in his element, the brilliant deal maker, the sharp businessman, the man who'd managed to fix his financial problems and secure his social standing. Serafina clung to his arm and smiled the smile of a woman who believed her problems were over. When the title officer slid the final documents across the desk for signing, Tristan actually snatched the check from her hand before she could finish the sentence. He held it like a trophy, showing it to Serafina, whispering something in her ear that made her laugh with genuine delight. Then he walked over to where I was sitting and looked down his nose at me, his expression the perfect blend of condescension and manufactured generosity. "Here, Willow," he said, his voice loud enough for the Whitlocks to hear. "You cooperated. You didn't make a fuss. I'm going to be generous with you." He pressed a thin envelope into my hand, a check that represented roughly 15% of the cottage's actual value. Blood money, conscience money, the price of his belief that he'd successfully erased me. I felt the rough paper against my skin. I looked at the check without opening it. Then I looked up at my brother's face and met his smirk with a small, polite smile so empty it could have housed an entire universe of contempt. "Thank you, Tristan," I whispered, my voice pitched perfectly to sound like gratitude. "I'm so relieved you've managed to stabilize your situation." The subtle implication that he was the one in financial trouble, that I'd noticed his desperation, sailed right over his head. He just patted my shoulder in a gesture that took every ounce of my self-control not to recoil from, and walked away. The sale was complete. The fraud was finalized. The clock on his total ruin had now started its countdown to 0. I went straight from the closing to the headquarters of Vance Consolidated Holdings. The building was in downtown's financial district. 32 stories of glass and steel, indistinguishable from 100 other corporate towers. But the entrance I used wasn't the public one. I used a side door that required a key card, walked through corridors most people didn't know existed, and took a private elevator to the top floor. The boardroom overlooked the entire city. Floor-to-ceiling windows showed the sprawl of development, the patterns of growth, the architecture of empire. Elias was already there, along with Dean, my chief financial officer. Both of them looked up as I entered. "It's done," I said simply. Dean nodded and made a single phone call. It was time. The first legal notice was served to the Whitlocks 2 days after closing. They were at home, celebrating their retirement, probably standing on what they believed to be their new porch and looking out at the ocean, when a certified letter arrived from Azure Shores Resort Management. The letter was cold, professional, and devastating. Official notice of infrastructure easement and mandatory demolition. In accordance with Section 7.4 of the resort's foundational covenants, this property has been identified as being in violation of federally mandated coastal setback requirements. The property foundation encroaches 1.5 meters into the protected setback zone. Per the covenants, this land is now subject to reclamation as essential infrastructure, specifically the utility hub required for the resort's authorized expansion project. The property structure must be demolished. The land will be compensated at fair market value minus demolition costs. The Whitlock's joy turned to panic in the space of a single letter. Tristan called me 36 hours later, his voice tight with a fury I'd never heard before. "Willow, what the hell is this resort notice? The buyers are saying their house has to be demolished for a utility hub. Did you orchestrate this somehow? Are you sabotaging me?" I used my best naive voice, confused, a little hurt that he'd accuse me of such a thing. "Tristan, why would I know anything about the high and mighty Azure Shores Resort? I'm just little Willow. Remember? The hobbyist with the sad little shack. Maybe you should read your own estate documents more carefully. Maybe you should have read all the fine print before you sold something that wasn't actually yours to sell. Buyers beware, brother." I hung up before he could respond, leaving him suspended in the uncertainty of his own creation. The situation escalated within days. The legal drama surrounding the house demolition was featured in the local society blog, with breathless speculation about Tristan's business acuity and ethics. Questions were raised. Eyebrows were raised. The Whitlock's lawyers filed a fraud claim against Tristan and his firm. Suddenly, the Golden Boy consultant had a massive lawsuit hanging over his head. Serafina called me next, her voice stripped of all its careful conditioning. What remained underneath was pure panic. "Willow, you have to talk to those Azure Shores people. You know people. You must know someone. Tell them Tristan is good for it. My customers think we're caught up in some kind of debt scandal. My boutique is hemorrhaging clients." I listened to her frantic tone, and I allowed myself to feel the first true surge of satisfaction. The facade was cracking. The performance was breaking down. She was finally experiencing a fraction of what she'd inflicted on me. "I wish I could help, Serafina," I said, and I even made my voice sound like I meant it. "But I'm afraid those corporate entities are very strict about their policies." Then came the second phase. Elias sent a discreet legal letter to Serafina's boutique, Chic Finds, the carefully curated shop where she spent her days arranging expensive things and cutting down anyone who couldn't afford them. The letter was addressed to her personally, and it informed her of a critical fact she'd never bothered to research. The building housing her boutique was owned by Seaview Property Group, LLC. Seaview Property Group was a wholly owned subsidiary of Vance Consolidated Holdings, and the lease she'd signed contained a specific clause, the Morality and Compliance Clause, which allowed the parent company to terminate any lease if the tenant's family members engaged in conduct that was materially detrimental to the reputation of the parent company's luxury brand. Her husband's confirmed fraud. That qualified. The lease termination notice was effective immediately, 30 days to vacate, all inventory to be removed or forfeited, no exceptions. Serafina's tearful call came within an hour of her receiving the letter. "Willow, please, you have to call someone. They're evicting me. My inventory, my entire business, my life, it's all there. Please, just make one call. Talk to them." My response was cold, clear, and perfectly calibrated for maximum impact. "I wish I could help, Serafina, but those corporations are very strict. Perhaps you should ask Tristan. He seems to be having trouble with corporate land law right now." Then I hung up, feeling a surge of power that was almost transcendent. She had nothing left to gaslight me with. No more condescension, no more dismissal, no more careful, cutting remarks about my little computer thing or my sad little life. She was drowning, and I was the only one who understood exactly why. But the best part was still coming. Tristan, desperately fighting the Whitlock lawsuit and the Azure Shores demolition order, had secured one final lucrative contract with Oceanside Acquisitions, a massive, resort-focused development firm looking to expand its portfolio. This contract was his lifeline, his last chance to prove he wasn't a failure spiraling into irrelevance. The contract was worth millions, and it represented a partnership that could rebuild his entire career. The contract included one specific clause, buried in the legal language like a loaded trap waiting to spring. Any existing legal action by the contractor that negatively impacted the Azure Shores expansion would result in immediate, full contract termination with penalties. In other words, if Tristan's personal fraud created an obstacle to Azure Shores development, Oceanside would drop him like contaminated waste. I had Elias send a private legal communication to the head of legal at Oceanside Acquisitions, detailing every element of the situation. Tristan's involvement in the fraudulent sale, the ongoing Whitlock lawsuit, the Azure Shores Resorts Active confirmed legal action to seize the land for the essential utility hub. The documentary evidence that Tristan's personal fraud had created a massive documented obstacle to a crucial resort project. It was clear proof that Tristan himself had become a liability, a professional risk, a man whose personal decisions had created corporate complications that no legitimate company could afford. The Whitlock's lawyers, seeing their opportunity for full recovery, included Elias's documentation in their own filing. Suddenly, Tristan was professionally linked to the crime. His fraud wasn't just a family matter anymore. It was a corporate issue, a legal issue, a public record. Tristan called me at midnight on a Thursday, his arrogant tone completely replaced by raw, frantic desperation. "Willow, you need to call off your lawyer. The Whitlocks are suing me for everything. I'll give you triple what the house sold for. Just tell the resort to stop the seizure. Please." I listened patiently, my heart cold and my mind clear. "The resort is not interested in money, Tristan," I said quietly. "They are interested in their utility hub. You knowingly sold land that was legally required for essential infrastructure. That's fraud. That's fraud on a federal level because it involved coastal zone management regulations." "I didn't know." "Yes, I cut him off. You did. You were the executor. The original deed specified the coastal setback violation. You would have had access to the survey. You chose to ignore it. You chose to commit fraud because you were desperate and arrogant, and you thought I was too stupid to fight back. Willow, please. The only way Vance Consolidated Holdings stops the eminent domain action is if you pay the full legal damages and admit your fraud publicly. You would have to confess, Tristan. You would have to stand up and tell the world that you defrauded your own sister. But even then, I can't stop the Whitlock's lawsuit against you. That's their choice now. That's their justice." He screamed a denial into the phone, his gaslighting finally breaking under the weight of reality. He would rather lose everything than admit I was right. He would rather face financial ruin than acknowledge that the quiet sister he'd spent his entire life dismissing had orchestrated his complete and total destruction. He hung up without another word. The annual Azure Shores Resort Gala was that Saturday. It was the social event of the season, the place where the resort's elite gathered to celebrate their membership in something exclusive and luxurious. Normally, Tristan and Serafina wouldn't have been caught dead missing it. But their current circumstances were complicated. The debt, the lawsuits, the very real possibility of financial ruin. They showed up anyway, because people like them don't know how to not show up. They don't know how to accept defeat. They don't know how to fade quietly into the background. I had known they would come. I had been counting on it. I walked into the gala at 9 p.m., not in the modest gray dress I'd been wearing, but in a custom-tailored white suit, pure white, expensively cut, radiating quiet, unshakable power. The silk was cool against my skin. The jacket fit like it had been made for me, which it had been, by a designer who understood that clothing is a language, and I was about to make a statement. My entrance was noticed. The room didn't exactly go silent, but there was a shift in the energy. People turned. They looked. They tried to place me, and found they couldn't quite remember who I was, which only made them look harder. Tristan was across the room, pale and sweating, wearing a smile that didn't touch his eyes. He saw me talking easily with Mr. Davenport, the CEO of Oceanside Acquisitions, the man who held his entire career in his hands, the man who was about to dismantle everything Tristan believed about himself. Tristan's face went white. He rushed over, a frantic puppet whose strings had been cut, and grabbed my arm. His hand was shaking. "Willow, don't you dare." I pulled away smoothly, turning to face Mr. Davenport and the small crowd that had gathered around us. The Whitlocks were there too. I noticed Edward and Patricia standing with their lawyers, watching this moment play out with the intensity of people who'd been waiting for justice. "Mr. Davenport, I apologize for the unprofessional behavior of my brother," I said, my voice clear and ringing through the space. "I'm afraid he's under immense legal stress. You see, I am not just Willow Vance, the hobbyist with the sad little shack and the little computer thing." I paused, letting that sink in, watching the recognition begin to form on people's faces. I am the CEO of Vance Consolidated Holdings. I am the primary owner of the Azure Shores Resort. I am the person who built the corporate infrastructure that this entire community operates on. And I am the person who has just watched your contractor commit fraud that has created a critical legal obstacle to the Azure Shores expansion. I handed Mr. Davenport a copy of the legal notice. His face changed as he read it. I turned to the Whitlocks directly, making sure they could see the sincerity in my expression. "Your purchase was fraudulent from the moment the deed was transferred, but Mr. Vance is fully liable for every penny. Furthermore, his fraudulent sale created a critical legal obstacle to the Azure Shores expansion, an obstacle that directly violates the compliance clause in his contract with Oceanside Acquisitions." Tristan stood there, his face a mask of total, absolute defeat. His entire career was collapsing in front of his biggest client, all because of the worthless shack he'd been certain was beneath my concern. "I want to make something clear," I said, addressing the room now. Everyone was listening. Everyone was watching. I am not the person you've all been dismissing. I am not the quiet girl who needs protection. I am the person who's been building something real while you all were playing at being important. I looked directly at Serafina, who stood frozen beside Tristan, her face the color of bone. "Everything you thought you owned, you were renting from me. Every resort amenity you used, every social connection you made here, every moment of status you felt. It all existed because I allowed it to exist, and I have just chosen to stop allowing it." Then I turned and walked away, leaving Tristan to drown in the wreckage of his own making. The downfall was efficient and complete. Oceanside Acquisitions dropped Tristan's firm within 48 hours, issuing a statement about irreconcilable compliance issues and fundamental concerns about business ethics. His consulting career was over, not just damaged. Over. The Whitlocks won their massive lawsuit, taking everything Tristan and Serafina had left. Their savings, their investments, their home. Everything was liquidated to pay damages. Serafina's boutique lease was terminated. She was given a certified lockout notice and 30 days to remove her belongings from the building. The boutique was closed, dismantled, erased. Everything she'd built to prop up her facade was gone. Tristan's executor authority over the estate was revoked after an investigation into his conduct. He was required to admit to the fraud publicly and on record as part of the legal settlement. His name appeared in the local news, in business journals, in places where people he cared about would see it and know exactly what he'd done. He lost his social standing, his country club membership, his position in the charity boards where he'd spent so much time polishing his image. He became a cautionary tale, whispered about at dinner parties, the subject of speculation and judgment from the very community that had once celebrated his success. Serafina filed for divorce and moved back to the Midwest to live with her sister. Her carefully constructed identity dissolved when the Instagram aesthetic of her life was exposed as fraud built on family cruelty. 2 weeks after the gala, I stood on the cleared lot where the Dunes cottage had been. The old structure was gone, demolished according to the infrastructure easement clause that had been buried in the Azure Shores covenants all along. The land was smoothed and ready for the new utility hub that would power the entire resort expansion. The foundation violation had been resolved. The legal complication had been eliminated. My cottage was gone. My mother's gift. My sanctuary. But the people who had stolen it were destroyed. Not just financially, professionally, socially, completely. The wind was clean, carrying the scent of salt and something else. Something that might have been victory or might have been peace. It was hard to tell the difference anymore. I picked up the small box I'd brought with me, the one containing my mother's seashell, her poetry book, the silver key. I set it carefully in the center of where the cottage had stood. Then I took out a small plaque I'd had commissioned. The Dunes Cottage, 1962 to 2024. Built with love, stolen with cruelty, reclaimed with justice. Here lived Margaret Vance, who taught me that strength isn't about shouting. Here lived her daughter, who learned to build empires from patience and certainty. I left the plaque there, weighted against the wind, a marker for what had been and what would never be again. Then I walked away from the coast, not with a look back, but with the quiet, powerful knowledge that I had finally completely come home to myself. The quiet girl had become the architect of her own destiny, and the world had no idea what she'd been building all along. 6 months later, I sat in my office overlooking the city, watching the Azure Shores expansion project move forward on schedule. The new utility hub was nearly complete. The resort was thriving. Everything was operating exactly as it should. My phone buzzed with a message from Elias. New investor inquiry from Tokyo. They want to know who really owns Vance Consolidated Holdings. I smiled, a small, private smile that no one would ever see. I wrote back, tell them I'm very quiet about my business. But if they're interested in becoming a minority stakeholder in the future of luxury hospitality, they should know what they're getting into, someone who builds empires, not just houses. Then I turned back to the work in front of me, the real work, the work that had always been mine. Building, creating, expanding, consolidating power in ways that no one could see until it was too late to matter. Tristan had taught me something valuable when he tried to destroy me. Strength isn't inherited, and it certainly isn't given. It's built brick by brick, decision by decision, moment by moment, in the spaces where no one is watching. I had spent my entire life in those spaces, and now the world was finally ready to see what I'd built there. The Dunes cottage was gone, but Willow Vance was just beginning. If you've made it this far, you understand. Respect is non-negotiable. My worth wasn't defined by my brother Tristan's cruel words calling my mother's cottage a worthless shack, nor by Serafina's constant gaslighting. They thought my quiet nature made me weak and easily defeated. My story proves that silence was my ultimate weapon, allowing them to commit public fraud. unaware I was quietly holding the legal power of the entire Azure Shores resort over their heads. I let them think they won, only to deliver the private, corporate checkmate that cost them their career, their status, and their money. If this resonated with you, share it with someone who's been gaslit into invisibility. Tell them, your focus doesn't make you strange. Your boundaries don't make you difficult. Your quiet survival makes you extraordinary. Because the revolution happens when you decide to write your own ending. My worth was never in question. It was only ever waiting for the perfect moment to be remembered. Have you ever had to prove your worth to a family that underestimated you? Share your story in the comments below.